I just wanted to first give a brief of what cities started as. Around 3000 BC, 12,000 BC is when actually cities began. Before that, it was a more hunting gathering lifestyle that people had, early humans had. And around 12,000 BC is where we see like pockets of early forms of cities, which you cannot experiments is what I could call it, began in various parts of the world. And they are called proto cities because they were still, there was some sort of a nomadic existence, and the cities were mainly to come back to, and mainly formed around religious activities. And also the invention of agriculture was the decide like the main change that changed the way into a more city, from a hunting gathering to a city approach. And earlier, what I think has changed is the dynamics is basically at, from adapting to nature to adapting nature around you to you is what has changed. And then there's a flow into early cities which were more sophisticated. So in proto cities you can see a lot of planning issues, one can say. Like in Katalhoyuk there were no roads, so one had to move from people's houses. If you lived in the center of that city, you had to move from a house to reach your own place, and that changed into early cities. And what changed from a hunting gathering life into a more sedentary life is ownership of land and wealth accumulation and inequality. Those things also then affected the way cities were formed largely. And so early cities were mainly centers for trade and politics apart from religion. And then we get into that remained so, with few changes until the industrial revolution in the 18th and the 19th century. And cities were built around the built around machines. So cities were built to accommodate machines, factories, and industry, and then the labor to support it. And industrialists became the key players of the system, whereas in the early cities, it was the merchants, the mercantile class. And poor city conditions and conditions, working conditions, as well as living conditions of the working class is what led to a more systematic approach to urban planning. And that's when the first kind of a newer approach to cities is discussed. And as you will know, one of the biggest push was for the better city is because of sanitation. And a lot of new ideas came at that time. Urban planners, like modernists, had their own ideas of city planning. And but what I would like to discuss is more speculative design in that time that came about. One was the walking city. It was there was a concept which was entire mobile cities which would plug in into an existing infrastructure designed by this group called Archigram. At that time, they were, uh, one could say, like leaders in speculative design, speculative architectural design. So this was what they came up with. So one was a plug-in city where the systems would be designed as a tower, and units could plug into it wherever you find space. And also that was the time when this, like, looking at the problems of the modern city development, that was the first time when a thought about nature, how the nature and city interact, comes into play. And Paolo Soleri was another kind of architect who had an idea of arcology, which is like the synthesis of architecture and ecology. And he designed these super dense urban organisms, one could call them, which kind of fit into the ecology of the place. Develop these forms of like super dense urban networks that kind of formed a network amidst the inside the ecology. And it was not anymore a separate, like city was not anymore a separate system. It fed into, and it was the word, sorry. And then, and so these are some design ideas that came about. But Auroville is one such example in India. If people know about it, it was a city conceived by a spiritual leader called the Mother, and the city, uh, it was not just a concrete jungle anymore, but synthesis of forests, farms, and the city in concentric circles, which could be replicated. But what Auroville and all these other forms of new design ideas also do is they create another sprawl around it, which serves these ideal cities. Chandigarh is one such example. So only the design, like physical design, cannot solve. Design should also be connected with the social design and social economical design, socio political design as well. So one such two, I have two examples of those experiments. One is the kibbutz, keeping aside the politics of Israel for a second. But when communities moved to the land of Israel, there was a discussion, there was a certain ideation of how would these communities, how would they be organized. So one form of that was the kibbutz. It was a collective community where the ownership of that anything of that community was a collective ownership. So the means of production, which is land, equipment, and facilities, are owned by the members, and everyone works for the common good, and the fruits of labor are shared equally. And then egalitarian lifestyle, because up until now, as you see, that the formation of cities was also the formation of wealth inequality, wealth accumulation, land ownership, and all those problems that come with it. So this was a new way of organizing a society. Yeah, and the idea is basically, and then I'll just share. So this is one of the kibbutz where, and then other example is of Rozawa, which is a Kurdish movement based in northern Syria. It started as one of the quotes, like one of the the fundamentals of this movement was that social change cannot happen without, or liberation of humanity cannot happen without liberation of women and liberation of nature. And so this whole experiment is based on the ideas of direct democracy and ecology, or and gender equality. Rojawa is based on the principles of democratic confederalism. So it's not a top down democracy, but a bottom up. So communities are organized, and then there are levels that, so depending on the need to have a centralized dictation is drastically reduced. And there's a lot of focus on gender equality and ethnic equality, religious pluralism. Economy is also a cooperative economy more than a competitive economy. Businesses and infrastructure run for the benefit of people and not for profit. So it's more based on self sufficiency than for economic growth. And there's a lot of focus on sustainable practices. One can see that if the social organization changes, there's a certain move towards a more ecological approach to social organization. And one can see that in the way these small community meetings happen, and how decisions are taken, like what are the triggers of decision making, one can say. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, cool.
Thanks, Amol.
Cool. So we still have time. So like my presentation is a little short. So I have a few questions, and since you said you prefer a discussion, I'll just ask you this. You said ecological consciousness would emerge out of certain social settings, right? So do you think there is a way of pushing for these social settings of a certain community setting?
As we have had our own discussions, and I've had this discussion with a lot of people, with many people, and one of my first question for this multi-species studio is, we are talking about equity for multiple species in this city design, in this speculative, why do we never start off from equity for the same species? How do we, my opinion, kind that once we imbibe that as the starting point, think the more um, expansive idea of equity will emerge from that, not the other way around.
And this idea of equity, how do you think we could, like, how do you think an idea like that would germinate in a society?
It's a very
Like, so you started out with the historical perspective on cities, right?
yeah,
And you said by nature, cities have been inequitable.
yeah. It's a, it's not just a linear, it's not only causal, right? It's a more dialectical, like it, something changes and then something changes it back. So I don't know, that's the exercise, right? That's the exercise of speculative design. My,
Mhm.
what I think about it is, speculative design should be more, uh, it should encompass more than just physical design of what should be and how should things be. It should also talk about, I don't know the answer to it, but it's
Mhm.
just the idea that we should also talk about social design and economical, like design of economics, how economics is designed around it. So it's just a start to a discussion. I don't have an answer to your, I don't have a direct answer
Right.
to your question.
If just to add to what Amol said, at some level, you could say a city is a bunch of material, right? If we see it even in terms of pure physics, you can ask what a distribution of mass in a equal city would look like relative to an unequal city. And of course, we're not saying that it should be uniformly distributed because you may need auditoria and things that are large structures, right? Maybe religious structures that are large. But I think it might be interesting to ask what might be just material distributions, of stuff in a relatively equal city. And if the politics of equidistribution is also the politics of, therefore, material equidistribution. And that I think brings us to economics, because I think that economics, designing economic institutions that equalize the distribution of matter might be the most basic kind of equality, right? We think of equality so much in social terms, and in India, of course, that's such an important thing. But material equality might be the first place to start.
Maybe.
I remember having this discussion with Amol the other day about also the value of one's time, and how, because in our cities people's time is valued is one of the ways that inequality manifests itself.
There is that, and I can also see that some people's time, of course, the very fact that time is valued is already, you could say, a certain kind of capitalist system right there, right? Because if you're marking out the day along kind of time intervals and there's a cost to them, then you're already very far down a kind of modern economic system. For better or worse, I'm not saying, but I can imagine that in a different system, we wouldn't price time, or we would price time very differently.
Yeah, like to start from a place that we wouldn't price time would be too abstract, right? We are already here now. And how do we now think of it? How do we now speculate about it for the future?
Yeah.
Like what is that one small thing, or not, it's not a small thing, but what is that one thing that can change these dynamics? As Sartaj said, it's time valued differently is the root of all these inequalities, that it's the measure of all the inequalities that are there.
Wait,
And it
if you
doesn't
think
look
of, sorry, go ahead.
sorry.
I didn't mean to. No, I didn't mean to
No, no,
interrupt.
no, and it doesn't really have, it's also quite absurd. Like just yesterday I was reading this journalist, and most of the valuable jobs are the least valued in the society that we function in right now. And he said the measure of it is how, if the only measure of whether the job is, he called it bullshit, but bullshit or not, is uh, if the entirety of that community goes on a strike, and you then know how valuable the job is in the functioning of the current, or in the functioning of any society. And if that is the measure, if we apply, the most valuable jobs are the least valued. And then how do we start thinking about this? But yes, you were saying something, Rajesh.
I was just saying that because time is the mechanism through which we compound, right? In compound interest, of course, the most basic example of that. But any equality which is compounded over time is suddenly in years, if not decades, will be so huge. And once you start pricing time, you're going to see compound interest take over sooner or later. I think that's my point of view. Anshuman, I think, has his hands raised. So, Anshuman, you
Yeah.
may want to come on the screen before you start talking.
You're muted, Anshuman.
Sorry, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah, my uh, question, or I don't know, point for discussion is you guys have been talking about time. And since the whole idea behind this seminar is to promote speculative thinking of a world which is proximate but not we're not quite there. And as I've been thinking about it as you guys have been talking, I'm thinking that time is probably something that is I can imagine like really radically different ways of thinking about time where it's not regimented and where I don't know, but even flexi time also has its like critics and all. But and even if you think about space, you can think about like alternative, for example, alternative construction materials, which is not so unimaginable or not so distant that we just can't foresee even getting there in the near future. What could be such a way of thinking about time in a speculative way, which is somewhat achievable? Yeah, that was the thought I had.
I mean, one answer, like one of the things that we were discussing is what happens if your hour and your is somebody the other, and my hour is the same. Like it costs, it's the value of your hour and my hour, or your, it's the same. And what social implications will that have on how the society around us is built, and what are the larger implications of just this one change in behavior, or in just the value of time is the same. And
What
I'm
if they
gonna
were
have
like
to.
different like standards across contexts, something like that, right?
So
Like
I'm gonna have to interrupt you guys there and start my presentation, uh, and then we'll carry on with this. Yeah, I'll just share my screen now. I'm sorry about my bad internet connection, but I hope it holds through the presentation. So far, we've spoken of design as a manifestation of our awareness and our aesthetics, like how much we are aware of, and what we find beautiful is how we will change our world. But we can also think of design as a learning tool. And I think some of you might have realized this with last week's exercise, which was to design a sanitation system. Because for many of us, including me, this is something very new and something we are not very aware of. And so I had to do my research to figure out how do you design a sanitation system. And the idea of design as a learning tool came to me when I was talking to a friend who facilitates people who want to build a house. So he helps them design houses for themselves. And I found that idea quite counterintuitive because I assumed that everything you need to build a house has to be taught at an architectural school. So to figure out what he does, I asked him, like, how do you then design a school? Because it's for children and they obviously wouldn't know the basics of ventilation, or how do you let sunlight in the winter but keep the sun out in the summer. And the example he gave me is, so the way they do it is you give the children a cardboard box and let them figure out how they would build a building, let them sit in the space where the school will be, give them the whole day, and let them figure out where the light comes from, where the ventilation is, and you will have the design basics down by the end of the day. Because the other alternative we have is when you give children a built school, you're missing out on a very important opportunity to learn something new. And so I think we can think of ourselves as the children with a cardboard box when it comes to many of the questions for designing certain aspects of Shaktivel, like this week and in the weeks to come. The other really important point I would like to reiterate is that we're going to focus a lot on speculative thought in this seminar. And what it essentially is the exercise of one's imagination. And we don't value imagination enough. For one, we think of it in this dichotomy of you have scientific thought and you have creative thought. But I feel like scientific thought itself has a very large use for creative thought. And just one example of that is Kekule's benzene ring. Like for the longest time, people knew the composition of benzene and what its properties were, but the structure was a mystery. And so when he came up with the structure, it was through this huge leap of imagination. And to solve many of the problems that we're facing today, we need these leaps of imagination. And one reason why we lack that imagination could be because of our education system, where we are given theories as facts. We are given theories as if they were taken for granted. But what if we were to start with facts? Like these are the bones of the forearm of various animals. And how do you explain these, right? And evolution is just one such theory that would explain all of this. But if we were to give these facts when teaching and ask people to come up with theories, is how we would exercise imagination. Another example is, of course, the evolution of the heart. And this image, very interestingly, I got from the Journal for the Research on Creationism, where they use this to counter evolution. And even the idea of evolution, the theory of evolution, sat nascent for about 10 years. For a decade, Darwin had just had the theory and he could not publish it because he didn't have a process. And the process of evolution, of course, is speciation. And that too required, once again, a huge leap of imagination to come up with. And what we have to do now is bring these ideas of learning through design and of using speculative thought to sanitation. So one thing that Amol just said is we have to go from the problems we have today. We just have to go forward from here. And one problem with that thought is that we end up compounding problems because some of the solutions we come up with to solve these problems will lead to other problems. And so sometimes it might be useful to take a step back and rethink the whole system or to rethink the whole design. So this is how we think of sanitation at present. This is from the PDF that I had shared as one of the readings. And currently, the way we think of sanitation ends with all the waste being flushed down a magic hole, which we do not want to engage with. As in, as long as there is clean water to take away the waste, we are fine. And I think the only problems that come are when there isn't enough water or you run out of toilet paper. But another way of thinking of sanitation is this. So this is where an ideal ecological thought would, how an ideal ecological way of thinking of sanitation, because we're in this bound system where the nutrients on Earth are limited. And as long as they're circulated on Earth, it's fine. And this does not think of the social or the economic aspects of sanitation. And so in many ways, it is a caricature of sanitation. Whereas for the majority of people, this is what sanitation actually looks like on Earth today, sadly. So what we're working towards currently is this system where fecal sludge is carried somehow to a treatment plant where a lot of the water is reclaimed, a lot of the nutrients are reclaimed, and can be then reused in certain ways. From the fecal sludge, a lot of the nutrients can be used for agriculture, which in some ways is like closing the loop. It's not perfect because we don't know where a lot of the food to the cities comes from, and we cannot match those nutrients back to the source. But as long as they're going into agriculture in some way, you are closing some loops, if not all of them. And this is is a reality today. Like, this is an image of a fecal sludge treatment plant from Delhi. And a number of these have come up in the last 5 to 6 years, and there are more in the pipeline. So one problem with these is that you're reclaiming water and nutrients at a very late stage in the process, which comes at additional cost in terms of energy, of course. So sanitation can be thought of as two separate problems. One being that a lot of clean water gets wasted because of the way we have sanitation today. And the other problem is of the nutrients, in that we are wasting nutrients. And not only are we wasting them, we are redirecting them into other, like rivers or water bodies, where they're creating other problems. So these are two distinct things. One is clean water getting wasted, and the other is the problem of the nutrients. So the nutrient part is very interesting because for the longest time, we have depended on guano from islands. So this is where seabird colonies exist, and their droppings are full of nutrients, essentially nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And once people discovered these in islands in Polynesia or off the coast of South America, it was a big business to bring guano back to the fields of Europe to maintain the fertility of the fields. And this was the main economy for a lot of islands until they actually ran out of guano, which had accumulated over hundreds of years. What's very interesting is that human urine has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in very similar proportions and can be used for a fertilizer. It hasn't so far been done commercially, but that's happening now. Like in the last decade or so, a lot of technology has come in looking at how we can use human urine to make fertilizers. This is one example from Niger. And this is another startup in Europe. And it is, I think, a very viable economic model and something that we will see happening in Asia and in India very soon. Some of the pilot projects that this particular company did was actually collecting urine from gatherings like music festivals and other such gatherings to begin with, before they made it a design module within urban settings or within villages. But you can also separate water and the nutrients at a very early stage so that you don't have to do it much later with the fecal sludge. So this is an example of a UDDT, which is a urine diverting dehydrating toilet. That's what the interface looks like on the left. And on the right is a diagram of it. So if you separate the urine and the feces right away and you dehydrate the feces, it composts much better and is also easier to handle. And the urine can then be used directly to make nutrients or to make fertilizers, sorry. And this idea isn't new, and it's been around for a very long time, from 1800s itself. But it's very difficult to use this on a larger scale. However, there is one example This is an example from Inner Mongolia in China, where a Swedish company tried to install UDDTs in a multi-storied building. The idea being that there was a water scarcity in the area. So the architects pushed for this, and the Swedish company it makes ecologically sustainable toilets. This is a lovely case study because it failed, and they recorded the failure in great detail about why it failed, and it's a case study that's published now. And the main reason I think it failed is because of the acceptability. Like, people were not ready for it. There wasn't enough groundwork done, and it didn't do very well. And they had to replace all of these toilets with the regular water toilets, and then removing the sludge and eventually treating it. But like I said, the idea is really old. And this is a sketch of a dry toilet from the 1800s from Manchester. So speculative thought in case of sanitation need not necessarily be about the design then, but more about the human acceptance of it. So, but one thing, like Rajesh pointed out just as we were discussing this, is you can design the interface better, because there can potentially be a very high degree of disgust involved when it comes to dealing with human waste. And also, at some point, you do have to come to terms with the fact that, as in, you have to face human waste at some point. Like, it is a reality and it's a part of our daily lives. If you don't face it, somebody else has to at some point, right? And so it's an exercise not just in speculative thought in terms of how do you design a toilet that is acceptable and that is ecologically sustainable, but also what is acceptability? Like, how far will you go to accept something that is outside your idea of acceptable? And with that, I will stop sharing.